Welcome to Empire State Engagements. I'm Dr. Robert Childs. Niagara is home to the world's most famous waterfalls, and yet, as Dr. Daniel Macfarlane shows in his book, Fixing Niagara Falls, there have been so many human interventions in the falls that they could almost be said to be fake. I spoke with Dr. Macfarlane about the long history of engineering at the falls on behalf of industry, electrification, tourism, and even preservation, as well as what all of this history means for our own time.
So I sort of went through those stages of sort of being, whether it's anger of like, how could they do this? This could be so much better. I've sort of ended up coming full circle to I can still be mesmerized and impressed. It still is a huge amount of water plunging over a really big cliff.
Welcome to Empire State Engagements. My guest today is Dr. Daniel Macfarlane. Dr. Macfarlane is Associate Professor at Western Michigan University. He is the author or co-editor of 4 books, including Negotiating a River, Canada, the US, and the Creation of the St. Lawrence Seaway, which was published in 2014 and won the Champlain Society's Chalmers Prize for Ontario History, and most recently, Fixing Niagara Falls, Environment, Energy, and Engineers at the World's Most Famous Waterfall, which was published in 2020 by the University of British Columbia Press, and which will be the heart of our conversation today. Dr. Macfarlane has also published widely in a number of fine journals, including the New York History Journal, where he published an excellent essay on Robert Moses with the enticing title, The Hydropower Broker, about Moses's work on both the St. Lawrence and Niagara projects. And of course, I urge all of you not only to read that fine article, but also to subscribe to the journal. That's 101.2 if you want to get just that one for a starter. And as you'll see today, Dr. Macfarlane is an interdisciplinary scholar whose work explores the dynamic intersection of environment, technology, politics, diplomacy, and culture. And as you will also see today, he is adept at navigating all of those complex forces and presenting them in a truly compelling way. So, welcome, Dan.
Thanks very much for having me, and I'll try to live up to that introduction.
Well, it's great to have you, and one of the reasons that I enjoyed both your article and your book so much is the quality of the writing. You bring Niagara Falls into each chapter in a very personal way. At times we experience it with you, the contemporary falls, and places there in the history of which you explore throughout those chapters. And so I'd like to invite you at the beginning just to talk about what Niagara Falls means to you in your own life.
Right, yeah. So I mean, I try to open each of the chapters with a sort of little vignette, some of them personal, some of them, more historical, but trying to set the scene. Part of that is just trying to be a little more engaging as a writer, since they're I do get into some drier technical stuff at times too, and trying to, hook the reader in. And I mean, it's probably a writing strategy too, to show you I've been there. I know what this looks like. You can trust me sort of as the personal, as somewhat of your guide here. You never know if someone's just went to Niagara Falls once and then never went back and then wrote a whole book about it, or have they spent a lot of time actually there. Now, I've never actually lived there, and I only have been to Niagara Falls personally once before my 20s, because I was almost born near there, but my parents moved to Western Canada, to the dry prairies a few months before I was born. But family was always back there, so we'd go out there frequently in the summer. So I always sort of felt more connected, hydrologically connected to hence the other books I've written about the St. Lawrence and the work I'm doing on Lake Ontario. So I was always more attracted to that area. But I never actually went to Niagara Falls till I was a teenager, and that was with my parents on a family trip. I think I was suitably impressed, but it's not as if there was, oh, I'm going to write a book about this at some point. But it came back to it later on, and then I started going to Niagara Falls all the time. So there's not some amazing origin story of I saw the light at Niagara Falls and was destined to write a book about it, but I had done my dissertation and first book on the St. Lawrence Seaway and Power Project, and they are connected. I mean, not just as part of the same water systems, but a lot of the same politics, institutions, agencies that created the St. Lawrence Seaway at about the same time are also manipulating Niagara Falls. So that topic came very much out of doing the St. Lawrence, but it was tapping into what was already a sort of a fertile ground for being interested that way.
Absolutely. Well, you make rather an astonishing claim in the introduction when you declare that, quote, one could almost say that Niagara Falls is fake. And right away, I was aghast. And then, of course, over a couple hundred pages, over many chapters, you convinced me of this. And we'll get into the details throughout the conversation. But for starting point, sort of as an opening salvo here, tell us why we should see Niagara Falls, that beautiful vision behind you, as fake.
Right. Well, I like the way you put that as an opening salvo, because that was sort of intention, provocation, I guess, right at the beginning of the book, again, to get people thinking in that mind frame right off the bat, since that's going to be a lot of what the focus of the book is about, but just to upend people's expectations and to get them thinking that way, because I don't actually, I purposely, chose language, so I didn't say it is fake. I said, sort of posed it as a question, because I think most people would think of Niagara Falls as one of these epitomes of a natural wonder, with natural being the key here. But because it's been so heavily changed and modified, and it's so heavily controlled, it really starts to skirt the line between artificial and natural. And so with fake being sort of a cognate word for artificial, it's to kind of get that it's somewhere in between here. And how fake it is somewhat in the eye of the beholder, but I hope to convince readers that it's at least not completely natural, and certainly somewhat fake in some regards.
Well, and you do, starting in the first chapter, where you give, it's rather ambitious to cover this much chronology in one chapter, but I think you do it very effectively with a sort of crisp history of the relationship between different groups of people and the falls, all the way up until the dawn of the 20th century. And the first thing I'll ask, because it comes back much later in the story, is what did the falls mean to the first peoples in the region?
Yeah, well, it's either ambitious or foolhardy to try to cover that much ground. But I mean, part of it there too is, a lot has been written about Niagara Falls, and up till the late 19th and early 20th century, there's lots of great books already on it. So part of my goal was, not to rehash what's already been explored. It's to give enough background for people to understand, while highlighting the important themes, the seeds, or the different things that then become an issue later on in the 20th century, and how those are created. But at the same time, too, you can't just skirt over, as you said, First Peoples and First Nations issues. I do try to talk about sort of the settler colonial history. Later in the book, I talk about with the Power Authority of the state of New York and Tuscarora Reservation, how they have to move them out of the way. But aside of that one group, most of the First Nations, the other Haudenosaunee groups and other groups that were around there historically had already been long before marginalized and pushed out of the way. So I wanted to at least explain that in some detail, which is, they had important lifeways, different groups connected to the water. Some of it was, this is actually, the waterfall makes a good place for fishing and catching different food sometimes, because, we have shifting baseline syndromes where the amount of wildlife we would see today would be nothing like it would have been. So you probably would have always had stunned fish and birds from going over the falls and easy to catch at the bottom, different resources that were easy to harvest there. And then it would have had, because of its Niagara Falls and its splendor, it had cultural, spiritual significance too. So it was important to a lot of those groups. And then I want to talk about how, once Niagara Falls starts to become seen as something that's commodifiable as a transportation route, water power, right, all these things, then it becomes imperative. And then agriculture, of course, around there was very important. So one of the first steps for settler society in that way is to get legally or through legal fabrications, to get people out, those First Nations people, out of the way. So I want to make sure that was, because if I don't cover it then, since they're already gone mostly out of the way by the time we get to the 20th century, then it seems like we're just dodging the issue of how that comes to be, of how that land gets to be taken.
Well, I think it's a really important point, and I think you're right that it's absolutely essential that you cover it early on, because what it sets up from the beginning is these conflicting views about the meaning of the falls. And that becomes a theme throughout the book. But early in this era of settler colonialism, you argue that displacement of indigenous inhabitants also meant replacing, and these are your words, their embodied ways of knowing Niagara's water and ice with quantifiable notions of the falls as a commodity to be exploited. And so this process of commodification I'm interested in, because that wasn't the only European settler response, right? The first European person to record seeing it is Father Hennepin, and it's just sort of these exaggerated, wonderful musing on the falls. And so you say for him and for many others, it became a symbol of North American wilderness. And so here you've got at least three now conflicting views. So if you can talk about that early history, because I think it really does set sort of the tone for a lot of the debates later on.
Right. Yeah. So there's the indigenous way, more qualitative ways of knowing from experience. When is the ice thick enough to cross on the Niagara River, and all these sorts of things that you would know just from deep personal experience of living in tune with that environment. And it's not to say that settlers who come then don't get to know their environments well too, but it's often with some different goals in mind too. So that commodification is part of it. How can this be used for profit? What part of Niagara can we transform? I mean, Niagara still stays for many centuries after that with sort of a magical aura about it. That's what's special, and that's part of how it becomes this symbol of how vast and untamed North America is compared to, settled European society where everything's farmland and people are everywhere. This is sort of a wild, untamed nature with all those possibilities. But that also becomes the possibilities of, as I said, profit, right? How can water becomes its value, not because of its water in itself and water is life, but water becomes something that's a certain amount of cubic feet per second to grind X amount of bushels of grain, or later on, X number of kilowatt hours, those sorts of things. So it's the process. And then, it becomes a means of, whether it's for canals or moving things, it becomes more about using it in those ways for profit or for commodification. While simultaneously we still see that doesn't just happen overnight. There still is these intertwined competing views of Niagara as something to experience, which isn't, but even that's a commodification. That becomes commodified, right? So people start blocking off with fences and you have to pay for access. So it's more a qualitative experience, but even that can become commodified as something to be only open to those who have the means of paying for it, or exploited for those, or exploited by those who want to profit from it.
Well, I think it's a really important point you make, and I think that you very nicely set up sort of these three visions, but only two of them really come out of this intact. There's the sort of soft exploitation, I guess we could call it, of wanting
Right.
to enjoy it, and then there's the let's dam everything up and see how much power we can get out of this. And I was actually, this is sort of a sidebar, but I'm unlike you, I'm not an expert on North American rivers, and I was shocked to learn, just a little bit of trivia, that the volume of the Niagara River, I mean, it gets, I guess the river itself sometimes gets overlooked, but it is astonishing, right? You said, did I get this right? 10 times greater than the Hudson. I mean, that's, if you could, that's something that must have been enticing to these people who want to commodify it, as you point out.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it is a very large river. Its average flow nowadays is about 200,000 cubic feet per second, which makes it one of the larger rivers in North America. I mean, it then goes into Lake Ontario and then the St. Lawrence. Most people don't realize the St. Lawrence is the second largest river in all of North America, behind only the Mississippi. So it makes sense that the river a little bit further upstream would be pretty big as well. But the Niagara River is also pretty short, 30 some miles long. It's got a gigantic waterfall in the middle of it, so that's not very conducive to using it for transportation. And it's the border, so it's not as effective. When you look at the Hudson, it's actually not a very big river by comparison, but it's very strategically placed for a lot of other reasons. So the flow isn't near as large, but of course the Hudson is, bulks much larger in the evolution of New York State for many other reasons. So it's not to say that Niagara is more important than the Hudson. It's just, but for that reason, the reason I put it in, I think, is validated by that it caught your attention too. It's for those who haven't been there or even have and just don't quite realize it, people think of the Hudson as an impressive river, as they should. This is a really big river too by volume. Again, importance can be, the way you ascribe importance can be done different ways, of course. So as I've already said, with where the Hudson flows makes a pretty big difference. But it's a big river the Niagara is a big river without a whole lot of tributaries. But that may be also why it becomes almost seen as more like a power canal in a way than a river that you would move along on.
Well, it's funny because, as you say, the way one defines importance is essential here, in the way that these 19th century people were increasingly defining importance was the potential of the Niagara as a power source, and you say it became associated, even in common discourse, with pushing the technological envelope, and yet. That also led right off the bat practically to concerns that it was being overdeveloped. It's sort of quaint to hear about people in the 1870s concerned over this visual blight and over industrialization, overdevelopment at the Niagara. So if you can talk about early on, even in like the Gilded Age, there's sort of this urge to push the envelope, and on the other hand there's the Free Niagara movement, and sort of that, maybe this is the first real contest of those twin impulses.
Right. Yeah. So there's Niagara, because it's seen as this sort of, at least according to the technology of the time, it's unlimited power. It's more power you could even use, whether that's hydraulic power, before hydroelectric power or otherwise. So you already had a lot of hydraulically powered mills setting up there. And this was before the creation of the Niagara Parks. So you would have had these factories basically right up to the waterfall. So they wouldn't have been on the scale of maybe, later developments, but they're also much more ramshackle, crowded together. And you can see them when you're right at the waterfall, so that people were decrying what's the visual blight that's going on at Niagara Falls. But yeah, there's that interesting tension that's going to continue to permeate the history of Niagara Falls there, which is people who want to save Niagara, to protect it because of its benefits for humanity of being able to experience it and see it in its unfettered state, and those who see, well, the greater benefit to humanity is the power and the industry that it can bring. So those are sort of in constant tension, very much there. And so it becomes a leader in different technological advances. So some of the first major bridge advances, suspension bridges, railway bridges come across the Niagara Gorge. It just sort of seems to make sense as a backdrop for the place to get better fame for your technological innovation. It then is, later on, it becomes the place where large-scale central station hydroelectric production and distribution is sort of proven and becomes well known, but it's not the first to do that. That often gets simplified into people saying hydroelectricity is invented at Niagara Falls, which is not at all the case. The major advances, or many of them, in hydroelectricity come from Niagara Falls, of those advances being tried there. But it's too simple to say it just invented all these things. But it nonetheless becomes, because of its huge power potential, and just because, again, as I said, it feels like a place where famous things should happen. It becomes sort of a good proving ground for a lot of these technologies.
Right, and so on the one hand, you have the Free Niagara preservationist response that helps it become, I suppose, the U.S.'s oldest state park by 1885. And there's some heavyweights involved in that, like the painter Frederick Church, right, and the Hudson River School painter, and Olmsted is part of this.
Right.
And then on the other hand, so it's the first, so maybe it's the oldest state park, but also it's maybe not the first, but the pioneering, as you call it, Adams plant, I guess 10 years later, and it became, in your words, a symbol of fin de siècle American progress. And so it's really fascinating to me how much Niagara was at the center of both of those impulses.
Right.
The preservationists, it's interesting. You note that there is, as I'm reading this, and as I'm seeing, because I believe you do have some of those photos in the book of this just blight everywhere, and so you're sympathetic to these romantic, environmentally conscious minds. But you note, hold on a second, there's an element of snobbery, perhaps there's an element of elitism to their movement. How much was that a complicating element in all of this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a mix of, and I guess I should add, it's Yosemite is the first state park, but it becomes a federal park later on. So Niagara is wasn't the first, but it becomes the oldest by default when Yosemite becomes an entirely federal park. So I'd say I danced around with what language to use. It's not, I guess, not the first state park, but it's the oldest state park, our oldest still existing state park. But it still is. But places even like Yosemite, when they're first, this is sort of out in the wilderness areas, far away from a lot of sort of civilization. So it's sort of a lot of that leftover land. This was quite different because this was a place people were already fighting over. So taking something that was already economically and industrially productive and reclaiming it was in some ways a much bigger step than some of the other early park developments, because it was kicking industry out. A lot of those other park developments, there is no industry already there. I mean, it's partly, I say it's partly elitist because those who could afford to actually go to Niagara Falls and experience it usually had to be of some pretty good, means or upper society. It certainly had started off earlier in the 19th century as, at first, well, I mean, earlier than that, it's only white explorers go there, and then becomes a little more, becomes part of the royal tour later in the 19th century. So kings and queens, but especially after the Erie Canal opens, that's the big key of now you can at least get to it. But who can afford to go on a 1 month trip to Niagara Falls? Only those with some money and time. So it's, they certainly have some genuine impulses for why they think it should be saved. But I say it's sort of elitist in that sense because it's, that's just pushing it. And I mean, there's a little bit of a paternalistic impulse of, if just the hoi polloi could experience this, it would lift them up to our level, and of that sort of thing. But it nonetheless has some definitely genuine concern for the aesthetics, the nature of Niagara Falls. But as I talk about too, there's some who actually, promote that because they see the opportunity to sort of turn it into almost I think I use the term reverse sacrifice zone in some ways, because if sort of a deal. Okay, we'll protect the area right around the waterfall for park, if in turn you let us have for industry everything else around it, a little further away, a little more out of view, not totally out of view, but farther away. And that partly once as they're realizing they now have the technology with tunnels and different things that they can do that. So it's kind of seen as more of a win-win. You can have your protection and parkland to suit those interests, but you could also still have that industrial development that you wanted. But still, there's certainly important, powerful people at this time saying, well, you know what would be what's really beautiful is a dry Niagara Falls. And this is a very widespread sentiment. It might even be almost, maybe it's the majority sentiment of electricity is what's beautiful. And so you mentioned the Atom Station that comes online in the 1890s. This is the first large scale central electric station, right? So, and then electricity is uses alternating current. It sends electricity to Buffalo over 20 miles and does it on a revolutionary scale. So this is what's often pointed to as one of the major advances in hydroelectricity and electricity as well. So it's hard to, I think, capture and imagine how revolutionary electricity was at the time. I mean, a way to think of it today is, I mean, this is kind of going on a bit of a sidebar, but if modernity is very much defined by fossil fuels, in some ways electricity might even be more key to modernity, because I mean, many of us, or at least I am, and I'm sure many others too, right, are fighting for or hoping for a society that's free of fossil fuels. It's possible to envision a society free of fossil fuels, or at least mostly. No one's arguing for a society or envisioning a society free of electricity, I don't think. Now, I mean, electricity and fossil fuels are intertwined, of course, because coal was used for doing that. So they're not completely separate things, but there's something that was, I guess I'm kind of going off on a tangent, suggesting electricity may prove to be the more lasting major advance sort of that keeps going on into human society. And so it was seen as that way at that time. People had ascribed extremely utopian visions to what electricity was going to do. And there's been other books that have talked about this more than my book, but, you know, for super cities that were going to be built at Niagara Falls, and the majority of the population would move to the city that would spread all the way to Rochester and all these sorts of things, right? And everyone would have unlimited power and just all these amazing new advances. So I'm trying to be balanced, I guess, too, to those people who see turning off Niagara Falls as the better thing. It's because they see electricity as being able to provide so much benefit for humanity that that's what would be beautiful. That's what would be the most productive use of these waters, is diverting it for that type of power.
Well, I think actually your contemporary comparison really fits, because you point out at the time they saw this is the greatest natural wonder in North America, is providing the possibility of these, as you say several times, you say utopian possibilities. Quite simply, you said it was unlimited power, and it makes for a compelling story if the greatest natural wonder of the world brought forth what some thought of as the greatest invention of modern times. And so it really does bring together everything you're talking about. And it seems like through the rest of the book, right, this sort of, these two different impulses entranced and ultimately vexed North American minds. You call it the profound psychological impact of this apparently clean and progressive electricity source, flowing, on the other hand, from the continent's most celebrated wonder. And how can we get the one without destroying the other? Because a lot of people want it all. They want the electricity, they want the city sweeping to Rochester, but they don't want to turn off the falls either. And so that becomes the big trick for most of the rest of the book, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, I think. Yeah,
well,
that's the trick.
The second chapter, you're a noted historian of rivers and of technology and environmental history, but also of politics and of diplomacy. And I think in the second chapter, you tell us that in the early 20th century, we need to be mindful that the devil is often in the details in this story, and much of Niagara's later history would be influenced by all sorts of choices and arrangements being made essentially in the first, 20, 25 years of the century in response to that outburst of enthusiasm and development in the previous century. Um, if you can just walk us through a little bit, some of that institutional and international wrangling that you talk about that really sets up the rest of your story.
Right. A lot of that is simply stems from the fact that Niagara River is the border between Ontario and New York and US and Canada, which I haven't touched on much yet. So it's good you bring that up, because that's key. If that Niagara River was entirely in the US or Canada, it'd be a very different story. But you have a very complicated set of arrangements. After that Adams station, the same US companies then open up stations on the Canadian side, but owned by the American companies, and then some Canadian ones are built, and basically you just have a whole swath of power stations going up to the point where it's producing Niagara Falls. I'm forgetting the exact statistic, but a huge proportion of all the electricity in the United States is being generated there. But more of Niagara Falls is in Canada. In terms of the volume of water going over according to where the border is. That creates debates about who gets to use how much side gets to use what. That leads to years of debates. Finally, in 1909, they signed what's called the Boundary Waters Treaty. It applies to all border waters across the US and Canada border, but it also has specific provisions in it for Niagara Falls, setting the precise amount of water that each side's allowed to divert, and setting limits on that, giving Canada the higher amount. So 36,000 cubic feet per second for Canada, 20,000 for the US as of 1909. And so they're allowed to divert up to that ceiling, with the idea being that above that might hurt, the aesthetics of the waterfall, but also recognizing that Canada has more of the water. So then it becomes, how do you most efficiently use that allotted amount of water? And then also, how do we change that? Once the technology advances, that amount was fine for the most part in 1909 because of the capacity of existing technologies and stations. Once you build more stations, once your generators and turbines become more advanced, then you want to be able to use more water. So then essentially, what emerges later on, which we'll talk more about later in the 1950s, they're already talking about doing something like that as early as before World War I, but it takes several decades of diplomatic and political negotiation. So chapter 2 is more about, and somewhat chapter 3 get into those. So we have different attempts, and then you have a lot of important federal, state, and federal provincial relations too. So who owns the right to that water, New York State or the federal government? A lot of that's being worked out. So Niagara assumes greater importance in some ways too, because it becomes the testing grounds for working out some of those federalism aspects that, once they're solved, then will apply to the rest of their respective countries as well. So it gets tangled up within the politics of each country, and then diplomatically between the two. So I won't go into all of that, because it does get a little complicated sometimes. But 1929 is one of the key dates where you have Canada and the US finally sign a treaty to apportion the waters of the Niagara River, giving them higher ceilings in terms of what they can divert. But that fails to pass through the US Senate. So it never comes into effect. And that had been based on also the recommendations in it, some bilateral and shared engineering studies. So this is pretty important, globally speaking, the amount of cooperation going on between experts from both countries working together. So that treaty also contained provisions for, in order to up that amount of water each country could divert, you could build certain things that will more or less mask or hide to some extent how much water is being taken. I mean, I won't go too much into them now, because it's probably better to talk about the ones they actually end up building later on. But these are some of the predecessors with remedial works being the catch-all word for any type of, dam or weir or excavations or shrinking of the lip of the waterfall. So it's sort of the catch-all word for the different engineering interventions to change the flow of water, or at least how it appears to flow over the waterfall. But so some of those are in that 1929 treaty, and it ultimately doesn't get passed.
in the 20s is this growing fear of erosion, which at the time they referred to as the falls committing suicide.
Right.
And so if you just talk again, that's sort of those twin impulses, how do we save them versus how do we exploit them? And then I had one more question about the 20s. It's very short, but anyway, go ahead.
No, yeah, thanks for adding that about erosion to make sure I get that in there, because it's a pretty key part of what's going on there. You know, I've been talking about industry in pretty general terms and just saying industry. I mean, it helps to know that, you know, what becomes the Aluminum Company of America relocates from Pittsburgh to Niagara Falls because of power, and then sort of this becomes sort of the birth of large scale aluminum and then all these other electrochemicals. So industries, a lot of what will become very toxic industries are developing at Niagara Falls as the power increases, especially as more power stations are built. So those are starting to increase in tandem. What happens is Niagara Falls naturally recedes on average several feet per year, right? Just the erosive power of the water going over that type of rock. It breaks away and it moves. That's why where Niagara Falls is now is many miles away from where it originally started on the Niagara Escarpment thousands of years ago, right? So it's always moving. And I have an image of it in the book with the different lines of where it was even just 200 years ago. It's a pretty appreciable difference. But that's inconvenient if you have infrastructure, either for industry, power development, or even just tourism lookouts and that sort of thing. If the waterfall is going to move 50 feet over, 20 or 30 years, that's going to become a problem. So recognizing that a lot of this industry, rather disingenuous, I should say, a lot of people saw this Free Niagara movement and then sort of what that morphs into the 20th century, basically the preservationist impulse. That becomes one of its major concerns is erosion. So they're concerned about what Niagara is doing to itself. That's so everyone's starting to use that phrase that it's committing suicide by moving itself back. It's hurting itself. So a lot of this industrial interests start to say, well, if erosion happens because of water, why don't we just divert water for industry? Then, well, that will be protecting the waterfall, wouldn't it? Because less water going over means less erosion. So framing themselves, yes. So framing themselves as the inventors or as the protectors of the waterfall. I mean, this is also tied into different attempts to limit how much water Canada can take for its power stations, as well as making sure that the American-controlled power stations on the Canadian side can maybe get more than the Canadian ones. Because what's also going on the Ontario side is the creation of Ontario Hydro, which is a public utility. So it's a fairly big deal in Canada's history, but it eventually comes to control most of the hydroelectric power on the Canadian side, and it is sort of the model for what will become the New York Power Authority, PASNY before that. So a lot of that's into the politics question you asked about before, which I'm trying to avoid getting too much into the weeds on, but it gets tied into that. But essentially, you've got this fight over, how do we? A lot of people may be agreeing that the way to prevent erosion is to have less water flow over. So it becomes the solution that works for both to protect it and increase the amount of water you can use for power and industry is divert more water, and then you'll have less water causing erosion.
Well, one of the very interesting parts of these negotiations also is that it's not just international US and Canada, but it's also regional governments. And so you have regional political figures on both sides of the border who take an active interest. In the US, of course, it's New York Governor Roosevelt takes a particular interest in this, and then later as president. And on the Canadian side, in Ontario, it's Mitch Hepburn and the Back to Niagara movement. And so it seems to be highly politicized on both sides. I'm interested in the role of sort of local politics or state or provincial politics in this story.
Yeah, it becomes a big deal, especially in the 1920s. And then, of course, you have, Elspeth and people that you've written about, and Roosevelt and Robert Moses's first sort of touching of the Niagara issues going on a little bit here. So, I mean, sometimes you have the bigger hurdles become those either state, federal, or provincial federal negotiations within each country. So, I mean, or it's a hard enough time already trying to do cross-border diplomatic negotiations between two countries, and you've got that complicating things. So, I mean, I've alluded a bit earlier too about, New York State arguing about what rights it has to who owns the riverbed. Is it a navigable river, or is it navigable at some parts but not the waterfall, and thus who has the right to build something in it, to obstruct a stream, to develop hydroelectricity. So that's still being worked out. And then, there'd been attempts, the Power Authority of the state of New York gets created in 1931, but that's after trying for a long time. And that's, of course, New York's public power authority, as I mentioned earlier, modeled in many ways on Ontario Hydro. So that's working itself out at the same time. On the Ontario side, you've got a whole different set of politics, part of which brings Quebec into it, because Quebec has actually passed in the 1920s. Ontario as the major hydroelectric producer within Canada in terms of total horsepower generated, but they're both still, by far the two big leaders. A lot of that power in Quebec, though, is generated for the purpose of being exported to Ontario. The Depression hits too, and then in the 30s, and so you've got these squabbles going on about jurisdictional rights over not only between Ontario and the federal government, but between Quebec and Ontario of who has the right to develop what, and then that becomes a political football in terms of they want to develop the St. Lawrence River at the same time, or the Niagara, and which one? And so I could spend 20 minutes unpacking all of that, but I'll try. I think maybe I'll try not to get into it too far, but it's maybe safe to say that's complicating things very considerably and stalling things and preventing it from happening, all of that together in the 1930s. Because you do get then, I mentioned the 1929 treaty that doesn't pass. There's another treaty in 1932. This one's not just the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Waterway Treaty. So it's not just about Niagara Falls. It's the centerpiece is more the developing the St. Lawrence River for power and for a seaway. But the Niagara provisions are in that as well. But that again doesn't pass the US Senate. So that kind of becomes the common refrain. They're trying to get an agreement on Niagara Falls so they can move forward on cross-border exploitation of it, but it's going to take several decades. And so, as we'll see, they'll try again in 1941 as well, and that still won't work without getting too far ahead of ourselves right now.
So, in the meantime, the falls were falling apart. 75,000 tons fell in January 1931 of rock from the American Falls, and then Horseshoe, I think you said 45,000 tons in August 1934. Obviously this has been going on for, I suppose, millennia, and yet people are around here. This is now a noted international spot, plus there's industry. How do people respond to these cataclysms?
Yeah, I mean, they are big deals at the time, and so they don't happen as much now because, without getting too far ahead of ourselves, less water goes over the waterfall, and as basically we've also stapled Niagara Falls in some ways, which is later on. So partly to prevent these big, huge rock falls, because that erosion could be made up of constant little falls or even just like rock flour grinding away. But it would often, throughout its history, will have these bigger falls where rock gets loosened and all of a sudden a big piece of the waterfall, like a huge trunk, 75,000 tons, will just collapse off and go into it. So, I mean, it's always changing its shape. The Horseshoe Falls is sometimes been shaped like a horseshoe, sometimes not. The American Falls has changed its height and gone for that's how it erodes, sometimes in big chunks, sometimes in smaller ones. So people expected that. So it's not, they didn't know those specific falls were going to happen at that exact time, but that the falls would be calving off chunks like icebergs wasn't that unusual. But it was a big deal when it did happen. But it also sort of pushed those fears of the erosion. Look what's happening, it's changing it. That'll become a problem too with the American Falls because there's not as much water, so the water doesn't scour away all the rock that lands at the bottom. So that becomes a problem later on, as I talk about later on in the book. Horseshoe Falls are big enough, has a big enough and enough of a plunge pool, it can more or less clear away the rock that falls. But so, I mean, this was news. Definitely, you know, this would be front page news in the local areas. And it would get in, you know, national and international news as well, because Niagara Falls was a well-known place. But it did give rise to the sense this is a place that needs to be more controlled. So that plays into not only the utility of diverting water, but that when they're going to do that, we need to reshape things in a way so this is a more controlled environment, so it's safer, essentially. Because if I mean, the big rock fall on the edge of the American Falls, at least you had at least a few hours or a day of warning. The cracks started, and you can, so there's actually video of some of those, because people rushed down to try to get some video of it because they could see it coming in that way. But I think it probably, aside of being a novelty, its larger impact is in pushing that desire to control this, make this a more controlled environment.
And so between those growing desires on the one hand, and then another world war and even more need for power, they keep trying to get some sort of suitable arrangement worked out. And it takes all the way until 1950, but that seems to be a turning point in your story when they finally get a treaty worked out, right? The Niagara Diversion Treaty, if you can sort of describe, because that sort of sets the stage for the next couple chapters, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think I call it the hinge point in the book. That's what it's the fulcrum of what the modern history of remaking Niagara Falls revolves around. Because so you had the failed 1929 and 1932 treaties, a failed Roosevelt tries an executive agreement in 1941, which is not a treaty, but it's an executive agreement, just doesn't need as much of the Senate to approve it, so it's got a lower bar. But that, as they're about to take that up, Pearl Harbor happens. Everything that's not essential to wartime production or can't be done in time to benefit the war gets pushed aside. And so, I mean, by this time, Niagara is very much tied in with developing the St. Lawrence River still. Once World War II ends, there's enough interest blocking the St. Lawrence Seaway and Power Project that it's also sort of incidentally blocking the Niagara Project to some extent. So what they decide to do is separate it out, stop trying as they had done in 32 and 41 to get this big agreement about the St. Lawrence and the Niagara and other water projects, and just go separately with Niagara Falls. So, I mean, it takes some time for them to do different studies, update their studies, come up with, you know, more advanced plans for bigger hydropower stations, because essentially they were in many ways still using the plans from 1929 agreement. So they needed to take some time from a technical perspective too, for U.S. and U.S. and Canadian engineers and technocrats to work together. So that still takes some time. They put out, you know, like an important report on how to do all of that in 1948. But that greases the wheels. So by the time they get to 1949, it actually takes very little time for them the diplomats on both sides to hash out a treaty, and then it actually manages to get passed. So after the decades of failed agreements, it does come fairly quickly when in the late 1940s. And so this Niagara Diversion Treaty sets up that the way it'll work is, I mentioned earlier, the Niagara River is about 200,000 cubic feet per second on average, although it's also probable it used to be a lot more than that, but then either on purpose or not, it's sort of been estimated down, partially to hide how much water I think has been diverted. But anyway, the point is, out of that 200,000 cubic feet per second, this treaty says that during daylight hours of the tourist season, so basically 8 a.m. till 10 p.m., from spring till fall, you have to leave half of the water of that 200,000 cubic feet per second going over the waterfall. The other half can be diverted in tunnels around the waterfall to hydropower stations. Some newer ones have been built in the meantime in the 1930s. Ontario Hydro built what was the biggest hydropower station in the world at that time, downstream from Niagara Falls. And then in the 1950s and 60s, as we might talk about, they'll build, New York and Ontario will build more. So they'll divert the water in these huge tunnels, which they'll build under this treaty to channel the water to those power stations. So they can take half the water during tourist hours, essentially. And then at nighttime, they have to leave 1/4 of the water going over. So that means they can divert 3/4 of the water. And this is during tourist season. Now, from the fall to the spring, 24 hours a day, they can only have to leave that 1/4 going over. So if you go to Niagara Falls and from fall till spring, you're seeing 1/4 of the water going over the waterfall. The other 3/4 are being diverted. So on the one hand, it sets up that system of significantly ups the amount of water they're each allowed to divert under the term compared to that Boundary Waters Treaty. And in this 1950 treaty, they're evenly splitting the amount of water rather than Canada having a higher amount. Although Canada will end up getting sort of credit for what's called the Agoki Long Lac diversions, which are, it's reversed some rivers into Lake Superior far away. So that extra water it puts into Lake Superior, it says it then gets to use, those however many miles and lakes downstream. So with that caveat aside, they're splitting now the amount of water. Now you can imagine if you're only seeing 1/4 of the amount of water that's supposed to go over the waterfall, it's not going to look very good. And I mean, that had already been the case as diversions had been increasing to some extent in the previous decades. So you start to see, instead of a steady curtain of water, you just have water falling, and then there'd be rock in between that, and then more water. So it wouldn't be a steady, full volume. It didn't have the sufficient appearance of volume, is the phrase they'd use. So it didn't look like a solid curtain of water. And then when that happened, it would also be, because it was thinner, the water would look white instead of green. So it changed the appearance. And so people were complaining, or they already were complaining. And this was before they even had started doing this new regime of only letting 1/4 or 1/2 go over. So they knew it would look, based on their model investigations, everything, they knew it would look bad if they only had 1/4 of the water going over. So the treaty also had a number of stipulations for those remedial works I alluded to earlier. So this is building a whole series of things. So digging out parts of the river bed, changing the shape of the actual lip of the Horseshoe Falls, shrinking it by several hundred feet, because if you've got a certain amount of water, the more area you have to spread it over, the thinner it's going to be. If you shrink how much area it has to fall over, the more it's going to look like a solid curtain of water. The other thing is, if you look at the cross section of the Horseshoe Falls, it's deeper in the middle, like most rivers. So what they did was lower the sides, so you wouldn't have because it's deeper, so you'd have more water channeling in the middle, and you'd have bare rock flanks at the side. So you just have a bare waterfall with nothing. So if you even that out so it's a little flatter, then this isn't the exact numbers, but it's, to make an analogy, it's instead of having 20 feet deep of water in the middle and nothing at the sides, just have 7 feet of water depth spread out across the whole thing. So it's to achieve those sorts of things. So they shrink it, they cut out certain parts, they put up they've used dams and weirs to help control how and where the water flows and what sides it flows to. So basically, and to do that to the Horseshoe Falls, they turn it off in stages. So they use cofferdams. So, to de-water 1/3 of it at a time so they can change it how they'd like. So essentially they remodel the Horseshoe Falls to try to disguise that they're going to be taking all of this water. And that's very much a cooperative effort between U.S. Army Corps of Engineers on the U.S. side, as well as the New York Power Authority of the state of New York, and then Ontario Hydro and Canadian federal authorities as well.
It's a remarkable project, and later we will talk about how remarkably hubristic it was. But in the moment, on the one hand, it is even just encountering this story, it is disturbing, like the hubris. I don't want to jump ahead because I think the way you deal with it is so strong. So we'll get to it. But even just hearing about these guys are literally, we're gonna fine tune Niagara Falls and make it prettier so that it's sort of that's sort of astonishing. But on the other hand, all of the engineering marvels that go into this, and in the book there are all these photos of these models that they construct and all of the detail and the intimate. It is a fascinating project that is, whether or not one approves of it, is an impressive undertaking.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And I was going to add that too, because I'm certainly critical of many aspects of it, but have no doubts I'm impressed by it. It is an amazing achievement. I mean, that's what I don't remember when I first discovered that Niagara Falls had been that manipulated, but I think it was when I didn't discover it until until I was doing my PhD work at the St. Lawrence, and that's when it was sort of like, okay, I need to keep, I want to look at that more. And you mentioned the models, and so this is very much, this becomes, and I write about that in the book, in terms of this becomes a worldwide advance sort of in the use of hydraulic engineering models and that sort of thing, and it's also very important because this is one of the first times that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and other experts, they have to cooperate with Canadian engineers. So it becomes this very interesting testing ground or crucible of shared knowledge, or how do they butt heads about things. And so each country wants to build their models because they think theirs is the better model and that their results are more reliable. So it becomes a very interesting sort of dive into the black box of how engineering decisions are made, and of how messy it is too. I mean, I think, and not that it's necessarily, the fact that it's messy isn't necessarily wrong. I think sometimes we have these assumptions about how perfect these sorts of things should be, but they're guessing a lot of the time. They even call it, this is the cut and try method. You slice it off, try, it doesn't fit, okay, a little more, try again, keep going back. But they're doing that on the models in many cases for the reason that better to make the mistake on the model before you make it in the real world. Prototype, as they call the waterfall, is the prototype. But of course, things don't always translate perfectly from models, because this being one of the times where they were working out a lot of the challenges of, can you use models to accurately predict a lot of these things? And in some ways they could, and in other cases, yeah, they made mistakes. And a lot of that was, the models and the fact that they're on a different scale. So water doesn't run the same way on that smaller. I mean, it is a smaller scale, but if you see the pictures of the humans standing there, they are some big models. So these aren't just the type of models people think of as like, a model airplane. This is like, they take up a warehouse. so they are still large, but they are models nonetheless. So they're imperfect representations of the real world. So again, this is a case of, it's impressive, but there's also aspects to be critical of. Although, according to at least I think according to the engineers' goals and what they used it for, it did work as intended. Right, so it was much cheaper to do the work on the models, and if you evaluate it by the parameters they set for it, I think they would have said it was a success, and things mostly worked how they wanted it to be fair, I guess.
Well, when we think of mid-20th century figures who achieve their own goals based on their own parameters, and whose feats are impressive yet perhaps complicated, on a program about New York history, one's mind often would leap to Robert Moses. And as you succinctly and aptly put it, in the 1950s, Moses was going to show up to part the waters. Now, most of our viewers probably think of Robert Moses as the complicated power broker in New York City or on Long Island, but you make an excellent case, both in the book and in your article, which people can see in New York History Journal. You make an excellent case that he should also be noted as the hydro power broker, and you wrote in the article that Moses had relatively little interest or background in hydropower, but he had extensive experience in planning the parkland and parkways that were part of these power developments. And of course, Moses had extensive experience when it came to moving people out of the way for large infrastructure projects. And so he's working on both of your books, right? He's on the St. Lawrence as well as Niagara, and talk about his role, the scale, and then also I want to talk about some of the specific stories of him moving people out of the way, but I'll open it up to you.
Yeah, that's very much why they bring him in. They realize this is the power authority of the state of New York, who's at the same time in the 1950s as they're doing all this Niagara work, is simultaneously handling most of the U.S. share of the power aspect of the St. Lawrence Seaway and Power Project. And so it's especially on the St. Lawrence project, it needs to move more people out of the way of what's going to become a big reservoir. Niagara is unique in that you can kind of, for hydropower, because you have the escarpment, the drop, that sort of help creates a natural reservoir to a certain extent. So whereas for the St. Lawrence River to create hydroelectricity, and in the Columbia and Mississippi and the Colorado, you need to dam it fully to create a big reservoir and flood out a lot of territory. The Niagara River didn't require flooding out the river upstream to the same extent. St. Lawrence River does, so it's going to need to move a lot more people. But they still know they're going to, for the tunnels at Niagara Falls, for the power station, they are going to need to build a new reservoir for the new hydropower station on the New York side. But they're going to put it in, not in the river. They're just going to put it in what had been property off to the side. So they're going to need to move people out of the way for all that infrastructure, either for the St. Lawrence or for the Niagara. So they headhunt basically Moses to bring him in as the ideal person. He doesn't need to know much about hydroelectricity. He knows how to tell people to get the heck out of here or we're taking your land, and how to do that ruthlessly and efficiently. So he's the perfect person in that regard of getting, and being able to grease the wheels politically for all these complicated political things we've already talked about. He's sort of the person to push this all through quickly, both on the St. Lawrence and on Niagara.
I guess the next part then is a lot of the people that he's moving out of the way are Indigenous people, and that speaks both to your story from very early in the book, and also to the sort of broader Moses literature. We can get to the Moses point in a moment, but first, this idea once again of disregarding indigenous use of these places, and just appropriating their land. Both in St. Lawrence, it's the Akwesasne Mohawk, and then later we can talk about the Tuscarora. But he is fairly ruthless. And one of the quotes that you have from Moses in the article, when he's talking about the Tuscarora, and I believe it's in the book as well, but I know I was just looking at it in the article, it sounds like something that some of the settler colonial advocates would have said back at the beginning of your story, when he says of the Tuscarora, the bulk of the land is not used for any purpose at all. This intensely ethnocentric, utilitarian view of things. So how does Moses speak to your bigger story? It's a long-winded question, but I think there's a lot there.
Yeah. So in both the two different Mohawk cases, with Akwesasne, with the St. Lawrence, they're on territory that cuts across Quebec, Ontario, and New York State. So it becomes a very complicated scenario, but it's also part of that territory is an island right downstream from the major power dam on the St. Lawrence. So they become involved by virtue of the rivers being changed around them. With the Tuscarora, I mentioned the new reservoir. So as part of building as part of the 1950 treaty that authorizes them to remake Niagara Falls and start diverting all this water, both Ontario and New York State build massive new hydroelectric complexes that will take all of this water. And they're both several miles downstream from the actual waterfall. So the water needs to be taken a long ways. And they're both in the gorge, sort of facing each other. It looks interesting if you just drive the bridge across there. You can see them beckoning over the edge there. But Ontario will build its new power station, which is the Beck number 2 in the early 1950s. The politics take longer on the New York side. It won't finish its new station until 1961, but that's because things get delayed for a long time because of whether it should be developed by public or private utility or public, and should be public or private power, and how much should go to cooperatives. And so it becomes a political football in Congress. And so that takes a long time. But the point is, eventually, I mean, it could have been built almost 8-10 years earlier, but it's not built till the early 1960s. But where they eventually decide to place this new hydro station and its reservoir, which will be right behind it. So the water will come from above Niagara Falls, where there's the big tunnels, take it to this reservoir, which will then, which is actually built up more than it's dug into the ground. So it's just big, huge earthen walls to, imagine a huge above ground pool, I guess, that holds all this water. But so it's going to take up, I'm forgetting the exact acreage off the top of my head, but a huge swath of territory. Right, this is very obvious if you look at Google Maps from space. These reservoirs are big, and so that becomes a political football too. Of where do you place it? And so at first, it's technically in the community of Lewiston, which is bordering the city of Niagara Falls, and it's I think more on initially it's placed more on just white territory and what happens is becomes pressure to move it, and it's not just pressure to move it; it's to economize, or we save money, and the land is cheaper, more to the north and to the east, because that's the Tuscarora Reservation that's abutting it. So they would have taken a little bit of Tuscarora land, and then they realized it's cheaper to move that way, right? So not only in terms of what you'll lose in terms of taxes, but how much it costs per acre, all these things. It's cheaper, and to be honest, it's going to affect less people because it's less densely settled, and likely Moses figures they're going to have less political power to resist him than would the white farmers and different people around. So they start with plans to move the reservoir more onto Tuscarora territory. So that becomes Tuscarora go to court. They've learned already some, I think, from their Mohawk networks and other places around the United States of some good strategies for resisting this and getting the public on their side, which they are able to do actually to a large extent. I mean, on the one hand, I've talked before about what the experts are doing with Niagara Falls. The public is pretty supportive. The general public in both countries and in New York State is, for the most part, supportive of developing hydro power from Niagara Falls and manipulating it, at least to the extent that they know it's happening. It's not terribly controversial in some ways. This is progress, and people in the 1950s, tend to agree with progress. But the Tuscarora, use sort of passive resistance. Moses tries to bully them. They have people write about them in the press in positive ways, and so they actually garner a lot of public support for people saying, why is Moses and Pasney doing this? Why can't they just move, or why can't they just build the reservoir higher instead of wider? And so that does happen to some extent. But it's several, and the Tuscarora go to court as well, and actually make it a fairly far ways. But of course, New York State keeps appealing it. So that pushes things on by several years. So Moses is getting furious because this is someone who's known for getting things done on time, and his whole project's being held up by these court cases and by some indigenous people in their land that they don't use for any productive purposes, as you had said with the quote, because it looks to them just like scrubland. It's not being used productively. It's not used for factories. Most of it's not used for agriculture. So what good is it? It's just wasted land anyway, like that. So let's use it for productive purposes. Eventually, it goes all the way to basically to the top courts, where they finally rule in favor. The argument had been that the Tuscarora arguing that Moses, New York State, couldn't expropriate their land because it had been, a reservation, and that prevented that. But the counter argument was, well, the part of the reservation that Moses wanted was part that had been purchased additionally or in addition to the original reservation. So that part's not protected from expropriation. And so that is eventually what the court ruling is. Moses gets sort of a victory. It's not a total victory. In the meantime, so they could advance with some of the infrastructure, they did change the size of the reservoir and build it up higher. they'd also been using all types of underhanded tactics to try to divide and conquer and undermine, and saying mean things in the press and trying to plant things, and basically, or even just disregarding the court orders and going on to land, surveyors going on to land, and those sorts of things. So it became, in some way, I mean, the Tuscarora won a lot of sympathy, and they forced Moses to change some of his plans, and delayed him significantly. But so it's complicated to say who wins. I mean, the Tuscarora lost their land still, so but they won a number of smaller victories, or moral victories, maybe in some sense. But I don't want to speak for them either in terms of what they considered losses or victories. But it's very much of this continuation of that historic, indigenous land is not useful until it's used for modern progress and those sorts of purposes.
And the attitudes of the people involved on the government side they're somewhat astonishing. On the one hand, when the Supreme Court rules in favor of Moses and his group, I think it was Hugo Black in his dissent, you quote him as saying, what are we doing? I mean, he doesn't say what are we doing, but he says some things are more valuable than money and progress, and we're supposed to be a great nation. Why are we behaving this way? It's sort of a beautiful, wistful dissent. And Moses's response after he wins, and they're going to have to pay the Tuscarora, he's like, well, you call him very paternalistic, and I think that's generous of you. He's like, I hope they'll use it wisely or something. I mean, it's just sort of, and then after all that, the naming of the station is a sort of adding insult to injury, I suppose.
Yeah, no, he's very much of a. I mean, he actually had tried to bribe them. That was one of the approaches. Sorry, well, not bribe, but upped the amount they would get per acre and build them all these new things. And because it also helps to know, they also got land from Niagara University, which adjoins it, but they paid far more for land that was the same land essentially owned by Niagara University, and they ended up not paying very much. Once they expropriated land, they still had to pay some compensation for it, but it was still pretty minimal. And that the generating station had been called while it was being built, the Tuscarora generating station, but it seems pretty certain that it ends up being called the Robert Moses generating station, and I think it's just because he was not going to have it called the Tuscarora generating station after they had crossed him in his mind. So he maneuvered, so someone else made the suggestion to call it the Robert Moses generating station, which is also what the station's called on the St. Lawrence as well, or it was.
I'll just before we let Moses out of the hot seat here, you do sort of you sort of stake out your territory in the Robert Moses historiography, somewhere between the prosecutorial Robert Caro and the almost laudatory revisionists like Kenneth Jackson. Ultimately, where do you come down on Moses' legacy in New York State broadly? Because I think your story really makes it a more holistic story than just looking at New York City and Long Island. So
yeah, I mean, I think I definitely come down closer to Caro than to the other side. I mean, I do see the point of you have to take the long view, and who in the long run, the long view, and if you take a utilitarian view, which is, I guess to a certain extent a fair enough way to do it, is how many people does it end up benefiting? Is it good for New York City, New York State in the long run? But I mean, I think there's no doubt I think that the defenses of him, I've tried to say, are a little too much. He's a man of his time, but I would argue, well, aren't great figures people who can transcend their times in certain ways? And it's getting a little too into, I don't want to get too far in great man theories of history type of thing. But if we're going to call people great, then what do we do it for? So, I mean, I can see the arguments for you set things up for New York City that in the long run were beneficial, or for Long Island. And, a lot of the power stations at Niagara and the St. Lawrence were going to get built whether Moses was involved or not. I guess you could look at it that way as well. But he definitely did, ride roughshod over people he didn't have to, and I think he definitely had, if you want to call him racist, I think that's fair. I think he thought very lowly of the masses that he was building these things for. So I think he also thought paternalistically of not just Tuscarora and Indigenous people, but the stupid masses that needed to be helped to come. And so this was his job as, noblesse oblige, to come help the rest of society somewhat. But I mean, part of the arguments for taking the long run were, he set New York City infrastructure up for the long run, but if that also made things more car dependent, and if we're going to judge things by New York becomes a successful city after, or it becomes a more successful city in the long run after, and because of Moses's interventions, then those contextual things nowadays, if we're concerned about climate change and environmental impact, if he also created those path dependencies, those should be held against him, I guess, to a certain extent as well, if we're going to hold those long-term successes in his favor, I suppose.
I think it's appropriately nuanced, and there's something else nuanced about when you're talking more broadly about what they're doing in the 50s and early 60s. You noted a certain ambivalence in your assessment, because you do allow that it was more ecologically benign than earlier intervention. Now that it's not setting the bar very high, but
Right.
I'm interested, can you be essentially anthropocentric without being sort of reckless and swashbuckling in your treatment of the falls?
Yeah, that's a good way to frame it. Yeah, I don't, if to use those words, I don't think you can be as anthropocentric as they are without being reckless to a certain, definitely to a certain extent. But when I'm saying it's more ecologically benign, that's getting at what I was saying earlier with that they don't need to create the reservoir in the river. So they don't disrupt the river to the same extent they do with the St. Lawrence, or they do with the other mega dams that I've touched on earlier too, of the Columbia and the Colorado. And because when you dam a river the full way across, that just has a lot of impacts. This is not totally blocking off the entire river. Now, there is a dam that goes partway across the river right above the waterfall with gates, but it's open most of the time and it doesn't extend the whole way. Its job is more to, they can close gates to help push water to the tunnels, and its other main function is to control the way water flows, so to control ice formation as well, which is something else I talk a little bit about the book. This is sort of some of the earliest advances in figuring out how to control the way ice will freeze and congeal in the winter, just because that's a problem for the intakes for hydroelectric stations. So a lot of that is including those models where they make paraffin blocks of ice to put on the models to try to figure out how a lot of this infrastructure will work with that. So yeah, it's certainly not that there's no ecological impacts to remaking the river in this way. I mean, by also diverting, if you're diverting for the majority of the year, if you're diverting 3/4 of the water around the waterfall, sending it downstream, there's going to be 5 miles of the river that's missing 3/4 of its water most of the time. That's going to have an impact, obviously, on changing water speeds, changes temperatures, which changes what species can survive and thrive. And of course, digging out and blasting things out as they did, building dams, is still going to have an impact. So it certainly changed when you talk to people who lived along there or look at the scientific studies, it absolutely is changing. The benthic zones and the aquatic culture that's in there. It also changes. This is something that I've actually forgotten to mention is, what they're trying to do with the way they control the waterfall is, in addition to ice, they think they're controlling how much spray comes up. And I think I've neglected to mention that. So with what they're doing in the 1950s is people have been complaining that too much, they get wet when they go to Niagara Falls because too much spray comes up. So when they reshape the Horseshoe Falls, they're trying to do it in a way they think that will reduce the amount of spray that comes up as well. But Niagara Falls and Goat Island and that area is known for being very lush from a plant perspective, because it has all that mist and spray, right, to lubricate things all around it. So there's certainly changes to what type of foliage and flora and fauna that go on because of changing the water regimes of the waterfall. And then, you know, something else I touch on as being the more indirect aspects are, you know, we've got this very toxic history of Niagara Falls. So of course, you've got Love Canal coming down the pipeline, not too far from the timeline when we're talking about, which is basically on, you know, on a canal, that an old canal that was abandoned that connects to the Niagara River just above the waterfall. And so that becomes a problem because that whole area is an industrial area. A lot of it is electrochemicals, toxins. So you don't have all that toxic waste without the power history of Niagara Falls. They're inseparable. So this is also one of the more polluted rivers by this time because of all of that. So that's indirect, but in the sense that it's not, you know, remaking the waterfall isn't what is directly polluting it. But if you don't remake it for hydroelectricity, you don't have all the other industries that are going to then pollute it. So people are already talking about at this time, one book that was written about it was called The Ravaged River. So at the base of the falls, people would get covered in this weirdly colored foam when they went on the tour boats, because that was all the chemicals getting churned up when it came down, and the water would change color and you'd have die-offs of birds and all these things. And then this is more towards the conclusion of the book. But when I talk about this being less ecologically, this is more ecologically benign than some of the other comparable large hydroelectric projects, but where it's damaging, I would argue, is in that sense of sustaining and fostering that mindset that we can and should control nature on this type of scale. Because if we can do that to Niagara Falls, it kind of sends the message we can do this to anything. If this is this big, powerful waterfall, if we can control that, that gives us the confidence to do that to any other aspect of nature that suits our needs.
Well, I think that's that very nicely goes to what I wanted to ask about next, because your chapter disguising Niagara really gets us toward the sort of the fakeness of the falls, or the alleged fakeness of the falls, and all those remedial works you've talked about during our conversation. And you argue, to your point, that the plans for Niagara Falls were undergirded by hubris, a faith that technology could remake nature without any negative repercussions. What is most surprising, you say, is that those on the front lines, the engineers, knew that this was never wholly true, but they kept acting as though they could achieve complete control. And so there seems to be a lack of humility in all of this, as you point out. And you also suggest that these projects are emblematic of not only hubris, but also what you label high modernism. And so I'll let you articulate this really fascinating series of analytical points about what we've just been through now in the last 15 years at the falls.
Right. So that, the experts had to, this is sort of the era of belief in experts, and they have to project to society as infallible. They know what's going on. Trust us, we're the experts. And at least that's the public face they tend to put on, and that's what governments do too. So there's the pressure on the one hand for them to present that. So what's interesting is when I get to see, I was lucky that I was able to see the internal engineering discussions and records for a lot of this, which is how I'm able to go into some of these things. But you can see that I touched on this earlier with the way they work with guessing and the cut and try. So they're much more within, working within each other, or between Canadian and American engineers, willing to go, we don't know, let's try this. And they're guessing, but then they have to come out publicly and act as if they fully know what's going on. But even just the belief, sort of this idea that you can model something and then that will serve to the basis for remaking it. We still, of course, use that today, but that was sort of is often, that type of activity is seen as an epitome of high modernism, which is the concept proposed by James Scott in his 1998 book, Seeing Like a State. So often the 1950s, 1960s, at least in the North American and Western European context, are often seen as the high watermarks of high modernism in terms of this is sort of you have the peak of deferring to expertise and the belief that mankind can remake environments perfectly in ways with no repercussions. So Scott does argue in his book, though, that you can't really have full high modernism in societies that are democratic and have a stronger civil society. So I pick up on that in the book to argue that maybe this is the projects in terms of their scale and the terms of the experts working in ivory towers with models still fits a lot of the key aspects of high modernism, but it is true that they do have to negotiate not only with environments but within different countries, between federal and state and provincial governments, and all these different levels. They have to adapt and negotiate. It's not as simple as just imposing from on high. So I call it negotiated high modernism in the book, just to as a way of sort of adjusting the concept, of retaining aspects of it while still applying it to these sorts of North American contexts in the early Cold War period.
So they couldn't be full-blown autocrats, but they could come close by bringing in Robert Moses, and so that was helpful,
right.
I guess. Now, I want to actually quote again from Moses' article to transition to the 6th chapter, because you said that, as probably everyone knows, Moses frequently employed the saying that one had to break some eggs to make an omelet. And this attitude, you suggest, was apparent in his efforts in northern New York State. But, you continue, the eggs omelet metaphor elides the externalized cost to the chickens, who ultimately pay the biggest price. With the many projects Moses spearheaded, it was the non-human environment that paid the higher price. And that brings us to chapter 6, because there's this cycle throughout your book of this sort of reckless development, followed by alarm over we're going to lose the falls, followed by, oh, we've saved the falls, now let's build some more, or let's do it all at the same time, which is what the post-war regime seems to be all about. And by the 1960s, you say now, the American falls were on death watch and once again became an object of preservationist activism. And I'm interested about the several forms this took, because in the early part of that story, you have this, you suggest, almost contrived movement coming from the Niagara Falls Gazette, choreographing an effort to get a movement started. And the way they initially approached saving the falls, 10 years later, the activism looks very different. So if you can tell this story, it's fascinating.
Right. So, so we've talked about in the 1950s, they remake the Horseshoe Falls mostly, right? So I guess I've been assuming most people, hopefully, who've been to Niagara Falls know that there's the bigger Horseshoe Falls and the smaller American Falls, with the American Falls aptly named because they're entirely in the United States. So, that's about 10% of the water is going over the American Falls, 90% going over the Horseshoe Falls. So that's what gets the big remediation in the 1950s. Now, the other backstory here too is that I haven't touched as much on is that tourism to Niagara Falls, for a lot of the earlier history, it was the United States side that received the bulk of the tourism. That had started to change in the in the 20th century, and that remaking of the Horseshoe Falls in the 1950s sort of finishes off that process, where once that's done by the 1960s, now the Canadian side is where you go to see see Niagara Falls. And then, of course, that's still more the case today, probably because they've built up a lot more, casinos and water parks and all these things, while the U.S. side has fallen on harder times and become, clearly part of the Rust Belt. So 1960s, you're already seeing that Rust Belt, the early impacts of Rust Belt, of deindustrialization and white flight out of the central part of the city of Niagara Falls, out to suburbs and bedroom communities. So, the city fathers are already starting to sort of cluck their tongues about what are we to do with about this. So they basically are saying, well, the Canadian side got a renovation or a facelift, and now it's our turn. So, and I've talked earlier about the rock falls that would happen, and that on the American Falls side, when you had big falls, the rock piles up at the bottom, so it's called the talus. Eventually, it was piling up high enough that it would sort of cover up almost half of the waterfall. So the water drops on a sheer drop, but then just cascades down. So the argument is, this is decreasing the aesthetics of it, and the Canadian side benefited from getting that. So it was almost sort of a community revitalization attempt more than anything to try to get things going again. But they couldn't just say that, right? So what they said was the American Falls needs to be re-engineered, but that is sort of part of this sort of wider scheme to jumpstart the economy and the tourist industry and everything on the American side, and to help it catch up. But so they use the Niagara Falls Gazette, the newspaper, sort of is the one that puts forth this agenda in 1965 in a series of articles and editorials. They'd already lined up support behind the scenes for it, including all the way up to the federal government and presidential candidates and everything beforehand, and then they sort of unveiled their big plan. So they say that, but if we continue to have this erosion, you're basically going to have the American Falls disappear. They're going just to crumble into a cascade rather than a waterfall. So they're going to die. And so the language, I think the Niagara Falls Gazette actually used was, it's on death watch. And so it's a bit of a manufactured controversy then, I think, in some ways. And I think they knew they were doing that to a large extent, just to prime the pump. But so they set this forward in 1965, and it leads to an official international joint commission, which is the body that helped oversee what's going on in the 1950s. It was the commission created by that Boundary Waters Treaty to oversee Canada-US border waters. And so it has to approve any of those engineering changes. So that leads to an official investigation under the auspices of the IJC for the preservation and enhancement of the American Falls. So there's several goals here. They're trying to decide can we remove all the talus? How can we stop more talus from falling down? What can we do to beautify or better improve and protect and preserve the American Falls? So as part of that, what they do is they try in 1968, but don't eventually do it till 1969, and that's they use a cofferdam at the upstream end of Goat Island. They put a cofferdam from Goat Island to the American shoreline and block off the channel that leads to the American Falls. So they turn off the American Falls. They dewater it. So it'll be dry. And they have it this way for 6 months in 1969. So basically, this just becomes now all the engineers and scientists, and it's like, ants on an anthill just scrambling they're probing it. I think I use the analogy, it's like, a sedated patient undergoing a biopsy. I think that's the way I maybe phrase it in the book. So 6 months of, drilling into it, studying it, why is this erosion happening? How do we stop it? And they do actually learn. It actually does change the scientific understanding of where erosion is coming from. They used to think it was more all the water hitting the face of the waterfall or the mist as it drops, but it turns out water was percolating down into rock probably much earlier than the waterfall, and so that undermines and honeycombs the rock. So that's why eventually, once you have that going on for a long time, that's why all of a sudden you get these big rock falls, as had happened in the past. So it does change their understanding of that. And so the other aspect of this is why, as I said, the city fathers sort of manipulating this or creating this is they figure this will lead to a gigantic increase in tourism because everyone will want to come see. They put, a little boardwalk is installed partly out onto the dried falls, and they think everyone will come to see it. But that is the case for the first sort of month after it's dewatered in the spring. But over the whole year, tourism actually dropped significantly. Now, it may have been because people thought that both sides of the waterfall were dewatered and turned off, and thus there's nothing to see. Either way, the point is that tourism really drops, and they're hoping it had been the opposite. So now all the Chamber of Commerce and the city fathers that wanted to, business owners that wanted to push this, They realized that if there's going to be a long-term study and remaking of the American Falls, it's probably going to need to be turned off or partially turned off for years. And if tourism is going to drop, that's the opposite of what they wanted to have happen. So they start to pretty quickly reverse course and go, okay, well, maybe we don't want all of this anymore. At the same time, as I said, all the study has been going on. And so the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and all the different experts come up with different proposals for what can be done. So one of them is what they do start to think though is if they remove all that talus, that's actually propping up the face of the waterfall. And so it actually make things worse if they get rid of a lot of the rock. But they come up with some different ideas for they could take away just some at the sides or some at the middle. Or should they put a dam actually below the waterfall because that will raise the water level up to cover that rock? But of course, doing so would also mean the drop of the waterfall would also be less. So they have a number of different schemes for what they could do from an engineering perspective, what they could technologically do to fix it. But after all that and several years of study, they essentially decide to leave it alone. Is to try to make an already long story a little bit shorter. So it is very much a different response. 1950s, it was let's change things. This was more of a maybe it would be better to let nature run its course and maybe we shouldn't intervene. So this is where you kind of see some of the breaking of that hubristic high modernist mindset by the engineers themselves. Now, of course, they're being pushed now by local officials who no longer want a big renovation because it's going to probably, they figure, hurt tourism. It's also being pushed by the time they come out and make this final decision, it's the mid 1970s, more or less. So this is also very much tied up in the environmental movement that's been, sweeping the United States and very much of a bit of a backlash against too heavy of an engineering hand against things. So it can't be separated from that. So it has a popular upswell to it. Although I did think it was striking the extent to which even the engineers themselves were the ones also saying maybe we should leave things alone. Now, to be fair, they also do. Well, they did all that. This is when they also, staple a bunch of the waterfall. Essentially, they put in rods and anchors and cables to prevent big such large rock falls in the future. And they do change some other things in the process. And they get rid of the Cave of the Winds, which used to be there. They get rid of the actual cave part because they're worried it'll collapse and kill somebody. So, they take the top off it and they remake the island, Luna Island, which is the little island viewing point in the middle. And then they also keep Terrapin Point, which is on the Horseshoe Falls side. But that's if you go to Goat Island, that's on the American side. That would be the main place you go to see the Horseshoe Falls. So this has been something that had essentially been created in the 1950s, right? When they shrink the waterfall, that's part of what they did is they create Terrapin Point by taking a few hundred feet that had been part of the waterfall, turning it into land. But because that was sort of artificially created, they realized as part of all this investigations, it's unstable. They're worried. This is where everyone goes to stand and watch it. So they keep it shut for almost a decade. You're not allowed to go on it. And then eventually they blast off some of the rock from it and strengthen it and structurally change it to make it safer. So it's not to say there's no interventions, but they do end up disavowing the really large scale remaking of the American Falls, which is in contradistinction to what they had done to the Horseshoe Falls earlier.
It's fascinating on several levels because on the one hand, the very forces who had been pushing for the re-engineering, the engineers, the commercial interest in Niagara, the newspaper, they all 10 years later have switched sides. But what you said a moment ago struck me while I was reading this and while I was looking at some of the photos of the de-watered Niagara Falls and just contemplating even before, and you have a good photograph of it in there, but even before I saw the photograph, just contemplating what it means for people to turn off Niagara Falls and just what that means, especially given the place of Niagara Falls in the sort of continental consciousness and contextualizing that in, as you said, the sort of popular environmental movement that's going on in the 1960s when people are fighting to save the Grand Canyon, fighting to save the Everglades. And in the year that they turn off, some of these astonishing images, you see a dry Niagara Falls the same year that you see oil all over the beach after Santa Barbara, the same year that they managed to set the river on fire again at Cuyahoga,
Yeah.
does this fit into that story? Should it be a bigger part of that narrative when we talk about American environmentalism, or is it a sideshow?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's part of it. We did a panel at the American Society for Environmental History on environmental events of 1969, where one paper was on Santa Barbara, one was on the Cuyahoga, and then I did this on that. But maybe that's because I injected myself and made and organized the panel and thus forced Niagara into that scenario. I mean, it's not it's not an iconic thing. I don't think to quite the same extent as the Cuyahoga River catching fire, the Santa Barbara oil spill. But yeah, it is up there, definitely, I think, with it. I mean, part of the way it's different is, I mean, it's visually iconic, even more so in some ways than, so, since there is no actually good photo of the Cuyahoga River on fire in 1969. A lot of the footage that's used was actually one of the earlier fires. And it's harder to, in some ways, it might be harder to present the Santa Barbara oil spill visually in the same way as dry American Falls. But yeah, it's very much turning it off, though, was, at least in the beginning, was part of that continuing business as usual of manipulating. The end result becomes, is to leave things alone. So it's very much tied in that way too, in terms of, I don't think it's a galvanizing. I don't think Niagara Falls being turned off was galvanizing to the environmental movement in the same way that the Cuyahoga River fire or Lake Erie being declared dead because of eutrophication or Santa Barbara oil spill. It's not galvanizing to that extent, but it ends up being caught up in what is galvanized. That ethos then leads the American Falls to be more left alone, I think. So it's definitely part of that story, even if it's not trying to suggest it should be quite up there with those two things. But it is a visually arresting image. And so, from an environmental perspective, I think you could argue turning off the American Falls in 1969 is, in terms of the visual history of that year, is probably an important part. But so, as I said, it does represent a key change, but it probably takes a few more years for that change to happen. And as I said, there's some pragmatic reasons why they decide to leave Niagara Falls alone, or the American Falls alone. That isn't entirely about protecting the environment as well.
Well, and as you pointed out, they basically don't do most of what they have. Most of their schemes never come to be. But as you point out, an even more elaborate blend of the natural and artificial is what resulted, right, with rocks sutured in place by bolts, cables, anchors, and concrete. And you also suggest that the falls, now much smaller in volume and flow, you call it a flowing facade. You note that despite continued tourism, there is little doubt that Niagara has lost much of its aura. And so by the end of this book, I'm left wondering, what remains of that almost mystical, sublime Niagara Falls? What should we, next time we're there, think of when we look at or contemplate the falls?
Yeah, I mean, there's some irony in that it now gets far more visitors than it ever got before. And, whether it's 30 million a year, or some of the numbers that are put out. How much of that, though, is because of Niagara Falls itself is a bigger question. I mean, you used to have people would go on weeks-long trips just to see Niagara Falls, and the point was to see the waterfall. Now the waterfall might be almost incidental to going to Niagara Falls because you've got casinos and all the other stuff built up, especially on the Canadian side, where it's the carnivalesque streets and all these other things. And so people don't come for long extended stays like they once did. It tends to be more of just a pop in on, and maybe go to the waterfall to make sure you for 10 minutes. So you can at least say you went to the waterfall while you were there before you then go on to do all of the other things. So I think it's lost. I mean, that was part of the argument that when did Niagara Falls stop being sublime, right? And there's been, some very good books written about that. Some of the other arguments have been, that it just, for different reasons, changing cultural ideas, Niagara Falls had also been the honeymoon capital in the early Cold War period. That change in cultural ideas are what left Niagara as no longer this place with such an aura. And I think that's true, but I also am trying to posit a bit of a corrective of, well, if we no longer find Niagara Falls so overwhelmingly impressive, that is the waterfall itself, it may not just be because society changed, it's because the waterfall itself changed. We are looking at a fraction of the water and a smaller waterfall. So it's not all cultural change and changing ideas. There is actual material, physical changes that I think are leaving it less impressive. On the other hand, a lot of people thought, and this goes back over a century, people thought what was impressive in Niagara Falls was the technology and the power of electricity. So it moves from being maybe a natural sublime to a technological sublime. So people would see the beauty as in that it powers all that industry and all the wonderful new products and electrochemistry and aluminum and all these sorts of things and petrochemicals. And so, I mean, I kind of joke that as I discovered and peeled back the layers of finding out what had happened at Niagara Falls, it's like going through the different stages of grief or something like that, of acceptance and denial and all these things. But I mean, I've gone to Niagara Falls so many times and spent so many years going there and researching it, and but often, it was a good excuse to, when I could get research money, I'd go there and rent something like an Airbnb or a house, and then just bring my family, and my family would all come hang out for a week, and I do a lot of hanging out too. But I'd be researching, so we'd stay there for extended periods of time too. So it means I could explore beyond just the sort of the tourist areas, but I still nonetheless spent an inordinate amount of time at the waterfall itself, and I still came back to so I sort of went through those stages of sort of being, whether it's anger of like, how could they do this? This could be so much better. I've sort of ended up coming full circle to I can still be mesmerized and impressed. It still is a huge amount of water plunging over a really big cliff, so to speak. It could still, and I mean, I joke with my students about, when we talk about how do you define wilderness? And so when I joke sometimes, it's, well, if it can kill you pretty easily, then maybe it's wilderness. That might be a way to separate what's wilderness from what's not. And to the point I bring that up because Niagara Falls could still kill me very quickly. And it's if I was to go in. So it's obviously it's not completely tamed if most people who would go into it would not come out alive. So I sort of came back to I'm so happy to go back to it. I can still go to the waterfall and appreciate it. And I think even if it is a fraction of what it was or could be, they also have done a good enough job of, as you mentioned, with the flowing facade. It still looks a lot like I think it would have used to, even with less water. So they've done a good job of, from the technological engineering perspective, of giving that appearance of volume, that you're still looking at more water than is actually there. So I think you can still, I'm not going to claim that it is what it once was, where 19th century it was arguably the symbol of the United States almost, right? This was the defining natural symbol, potentially. It's not that anymore. In fact, I think it's now more seen as in the 20th century became more seen as a Canadian waterfall even than an American one. And is now more inscribed in Canadian identity arguably, than American. But you can still go there, I think, and I think it still is impressive to go see the waterfall if someone's never been. And when I talk to people, I think most people still feel that way, because you did get back in the day, you would have lots of voices. I think people like Oscar Wilde and other famous people would go and then kind of say they were disappointed at Niagara Falls. And this was before it had been heavily manipulated, but that's because it had been so built up. Now maybe we have the opposite thing of you're not led to expect quite as much. So you might actually, if someone's never been there, I think they would be actually surprised by how big and powerful this thing still is, even though I do find it, sort of, and that's where I'm of two minds of, but I'm also very disenchanted by what we've done to it and have some questions about how appropriate all that is.
Well, I'm glad you talked about this, because that's actually, I wanted to wrap up with your views. So you've actually answered a good portion of my final question, because you write, as you've just articulated, that you're personally conflicted about the history of Niagara Falls, and I think you've expressed that very nicely here. I guess then, what do we as readers who want to be mindful of this history, but also perhaps surrender to the remaining magic that is still there, how do we reconcile this? How do you reconcile it? And what should we see when we look at it? Should we see a sort of human engineered cool thing to look at, almost a work of public art, or a sort of hybrid of the natural sublime with the engineered, or a cautionary tale, right? At the end of the day, what are we looking at when we look at Horseshoe or the American Falls or anything else?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and I've been asked that before, different versions of it. I still don't know if I have a great answer that goes beyond me just hemming and hawing back and forth in both directions. Because, I mean, on the one hand, it's compared to fossil fuels, this is a much cleaner source of energy, even though, as we now know, hydroelectricity is not near as benign for various reasons as we once thought it was. And this does, to backtrack a bit, those huge reservoirs I talked about, we've learned somewhat recently emit a lot of methane, which is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. But because of the type of reservoir this was, that wasn't flooding out an existing river, it probably didn't emit that much of it compared to other big projects. So that's one of the other reasons I might say it's not maybe as destructive as some other large projects, but it's still, I still do think of it as sort of a sacrilege and a destruction, because this is something that seems kind of sacred, and that's a very fuzzy thing of who defines that and who gets to decide. But there's something to me that definitely seems wrong, because for the sake of electricity, is it worth doing this? What intangible things do we lose by doing this to it and by commodifying it? So even if the waterfall still looks impressive, that mindset of commodifying it is what leads to all the factories and all the tourist banana stuff or ridiculous stuff all around it, and that encroaches on the experience, I think, in lots of ways, because it can be very hard to, this is where I get conflicted. I can find myself entranced by the waterfall and everything else fades away and I just see the waterfall, because of it sort of has a hypnotic effect to it. And then other times you can't see anything but all the concrete and steel and high rises and everything else all around it, and all the commodification of everything. So part of me still, thinks it's been in place this long. I'm not saying we should get rid of what's there, but maybe if I could go back, I don't know if I could prevent it from having happened in the first place, maybe I would do that. But as I said, I'm not sure I have a totally great answer in either direction. I remain conflicted about it. And in a way, I kind of hope the book would try to give some voice to both sides, even though I think I'm probably more critical than I am laudatory about it, but give some recognition where it's due, while still saying maybe it's not what actually happened at Niagara Falls, may not be, even if that isn't that bad, it's this mindset that it helps foster can be quite destructive. And if we continue that mindset as a societies of controlling and commodifying things, that we're going to continue to be in trouble. So for lack of a better answer, maybe I'll just end on that.
Well, I think it's a fine answer, and I think that it's appropriately nuanced, and I think that you're right also. Those seeking an even more fleshed out answer should check out the book, because it is a splendid read, and I strongly invite everybody to check it out. The book, as you see, is Fixing Niagara Falls by Dr. Daniel Macfarlane. It is from University of British Columbia Press. Dan, I'm so grateful for your scholarship and your kindness, and for being a great author to work with for the journal, and now for your generosity with your time. So thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, for all you do to promote New York history, and for anyone who's listening, thank you for taking the time to listen to us as well.